Picture this. You are a Norse sailor, deep in the North Atlantic, far from any known shore. The coastline disappeared days ago. Cold wind cuts through layers of wool and leather. Waves crash into the longship again and again, soaking everything on board. Your fingers are stiff. Salt water freezes onto your clothing before you can even brush it away. There is no shelter above you, no engine pushing you forward, no rescue waiting beyond the horizon, just open sea, sky, and wood. Now comes the most surprising part. There is no fire. Not for cooking, not for warmth, not even for survival. For most people today, that sounds impossible. Yet Norse sailors repeatedly crossed some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. They reached Iceland, settled Greenland, and even arrived on the shores of North America centuries before most of Europe knew those lands existed. So how did they survive? Was it extraordinary toughness, some forgotten survival secret, or were they simply willing to endure suffering that would overwhelm almost anyone today? The answer is far more fascinating. Their survival wasn't built on strength or courage alone. It depended on a carefully developed system, a combination of knowledge, materials, and ship design refined across generations. Together, these allowed Norse sailors to survive freezing seas without relying on what we instinctively think is essential: fire. But before we understand how they managed that, we first need to answer a deeper question. Why would experienced sailors deliberately cross an icy ocean without the one thing every human associates with warmth? The answer isn't that Vikings couldn't make fire. It's that using it aboard a wooden longship in the middle of the ocean may have been far more dangerous than the freezing cold itself. A single spark drifts through the air. An ember breaks free from a small flame and lands on a tar-coated wooden plank. For a moment, nothing happens. Then the wind catches it. In seconds, what was meant to provide warmth could become a disaster. From the safety of land, the solution seems obvious. If you're freezing, you build a fire. But aboard a Viking longship in the middle of the North Atlantic, that instinct could be deadly. These ships were built for speed and endurance, not comfort. Their hulls were made from overlapping oak planks, sealed with tar. Thick ropes stretched across the deck, while a massive wool sail caught every shift of the wind. The crew stood shoulder to shoulder in an open space with almost no protection from the freezing weather. In conditions like these, fire was dangerously unpredictable. A single ember could ignite a sail. A crashing wave could scatter burning coals across the deck. One sudden roll of the ship could send flames sliding into tar-coated wood. And if a fire started at sea, there was nowhere to escape, no safe place to contain it, almost no chance of stopping it before it spread through the vessel. Archaeology supports this picture. Excavated Viking ships show no evidence of permanent hearths built for long voyages. The reason is simple. Open wooden ships exposed to constant wind made permanent onboard fires both impractical and dangerous. This doesn't mean the Norse couldn't make fire. It means they understood exactly when not to use it. So instead of creating more heat, they focused on preserving the heat their own bodies already produced. That single decision became the foundation of their survival. But keeping body heat required something far more valuable than fire, and its story begins with an animal grazing quietly on the rugged hills of Scandinavia. Imagine preparing for a voyage that could last weeks across freezing seas. Most people would focus on the ship. The Norse focused on something far less obvious: the sheep. These weren't modern commercial breeds. They were hardy northern landrace sheep, shaped by generations of cold, wet, and wind. Instead of a single coat, they grew two natural layers of protection. The outer layer helped rain and sea spray run off before they could soak deeply into the wool. Beneath it, a dense undercoat trapped warm air close to the body, creating powerful insulation even in freezing conditions. That made all the difference. Even when the wool became damp, it continued to insulate because much of its warmth came from the air trapped within its fibers. In a world where staying completely dry was almost impossible, that was a life-saving advantage. Picture a Viking sailor standing in freezing spray as waves crash over the bow. Much of the water rolls off his thick wool cloak while the icy wind howls across the open sea. Every moment the cloak slows heat loss gives his body another chance to keep working. But the Norse didn't rely on raw wool alone. They wove it into dense fabrics that blocked the wind and slowed water from reaching the layers beneath. They also left much of the wool's natural lanolin intact, adding even more resistance to moisture. Together, these choices created far more than ordinary clothing. They built an insulating system designed not to eliminate the cold, but to keep precious body heat from escaping. But even the finest wool couldn't create heat on its own. To survive the freezing North Atlantic, Viking sailors needed another source of warmth, and they carried it inside their own bodies. That secret began with what they chose to eat. A thick wool cloak could slow the cold, but it couldn't create warmth. That job belonged to the human body. Surviving a freezing voyage wasn't just about clothing. It depended just as much on what Viking sailors put inside their bodies. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Norse communities relied heavily on marine foods. Fish, seals, preserved meats, dairy products, and other energy-rich foods formed the foundation of their diet. These choices weren't simply about taste, they were about survival. Because at sea, food wasn't just nourishment, it was fuel. The harder the crew rowed against wind and waves, the more heat their bodies naturally produced. Hours of relentless effort demanded enormous amounts of energy. Without enough food, even the warmest clothing would eventually fail because the body could no longer generate the heat needed to stay alive. Fat was especially valuable. Compared with carbohydrates or lean meat alone, animal fat contains far more energy per gram. Butter, rendered animal fats, and oily marine foods provided the dense fuel needed to sustain long periods of exhausting work in freezing conditions. Picture a rower pulling against icy waves for hours. His muscles burn. His breath turns to mist. Every stroke fights not only the sea, but also the cold, trying to drain heat from his body. Food also had to survive the voyage. Hard cheeses, dried fish, smoked meat, and preserved dairy products could last for weeks aboard a damp ship. Freshness mattered far less than reliability. Together, clothing and food formed a single survival system. One slowed the loss of heat. The other replaced the energy needed to create it. But even that wasn't enough. The Vikings discovered that survival at sea also depended on something far less obvious: the way an entire crew worked, rested, and endured together when one mistake could cost every life on board. Imagine the rowing suddenly stops. The oars fall silent. Almost immediately, the warmth built up from hours of hard work begins fading into the freezing air. For Viking sailors, that wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. That's why survival depended on more than clothing and food. It also depended on constant movement. Every pull of an oar generated heat from inside the body. Rowing a long ship through rough seas demanded relentless effort, turning each sailor into a living source of warmth. In a world where open fire wasn't a safe option, the crew themselves became the ship's heating system. But no one could row forever. Crews likely rotated duties out of practical necessity. While one group kept the ship moving, another rested before returning to the oars. This helped prevent exhaustion and may also have helped maintain body heat throughout the voyage. Night brought a different challenge. As physical work slowed, so did heat production. You can almost hear the wind pressing against the hull. Beneath heavy wool coverings, the crew likely rested close together, sharing warmth in the darkness. By reducing exposed skin and relying on body heat, they slowed the loss of precious warmth through the freezing night. This wasn't unique to the Norse. Cold weather cultures around the world developed similar survival practices, relying on shared warmth instead of facing the cold alone. What's remarkable is that the Vikings achieved all of this without understanding thermodynamics. They didn't need scientific equations. Generations of experience had already taught them what worked, and each successful voyage passed that knowledge to the next crew. But how do we know these survival methods actually worked? The strongest evidence didn't come from ancient shipwrecks. It came from modern sailors who dared to cross the same freezing waters using Viking technology. For centuries, historians could only study Viking ships after they had been buried, broken apart, or preserved in museums. But a wooden ship behind glass can't answer one important question. What was it actually like to sail one? To find out, researchers built a full-scale reconstruction of an 11th century Viking longship using traditional materials and construction methods. The project became known as the Sea Stallion, and its purpose was simple: return the ancient design to the open sea. The results were remarkable. The reconstructed ship completed demanding voyages across the North Atlantic in conditions that closely resembled those faced by medieval Norse sailors. Modern volunteers endured freezing rain, relentless wind, heavy seas, and hours of exhausting rowing. One lesson quickly became impossible to ignore. The wool worked. Soaked crew members kept rowing through icy rain while layered wool clothing continued to insulate, even after becoming wet. The voyage demonstrated that traditional wool was far better suited to these harsh conditions than many people expected. Some volunteers noticed something else. In certain situations, the traditional wool layers performed surprisingly well compared with some of the modern gear brought on the expedition. Even then, results depended on the weather, proper layering, and careful clothing management. The reconstruction revealed something archaeology alone could never show. Survival didn't depend on one piece of equipment. It depended on an entire system. Wet clothing was rotated, wrung out whenever possible, and adjusted between rowing shifts. Every small decision mattered because in such an unforgiving environment, no mistake stayed small for long. The voyage didn't romanticize Viking life. It proved just how demanding these crossings truly were, and showed that many traditional survival methods genuinely worked. Yet even this remarkable expedition couldn't answer every question. Some of the greatest mysteries of Viking navigation and survival are still waiting to be solved. A cold wind rolls across the empty North Atlantic, where sea and sky merge into a single horizon. Even after decades of archaeological discoveries, the Viking survival system is still not completely understood. Some of its most fascinating details remain unsolved. Take the shelters carried aboard longships. Historical sources describe a removable covering, known as a T-jawled, that could be raised over part of the ship. Researchers agree it was useful when vessels were anchored or pulled onto shore for the night. But what happened in the middle of the open ocean? That remains far less certain. There is no clear evidence showing how often these coverings were used during dangerous sea crossings. Strong winds, crashing waves, and the constant motion of the ship may have made them impractical during the harshest parts of a voyage. Navigation presents another mystery. Without maps or modern instruments, Viking sailors likely relied on experience, the position of the sun, changing weather, ocean swells, birds, whales, and practical knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Exactly how they combine these clues into reliable navigation is still an active area of research. Climate adds another piece to the puzzle. Many famous voyages took place during the medieval warm period, when parts of the North Atlantic may have been somewhat milder than in later centuries. But warmer never meant safe. Winter storms, freezing spray, and unpredictable seas remained constant dangers. Every voyage demanded absolute respect for the ocean. The unanswered questions do not weaken the Viking story. They make it even more remarkable, because despite everything we still don't know, one conclusion remains clear. Their survival depended not on luck, but on careful preparation, practical knowledge, and a system refined across generations. And when all those pieces finally come together, they reveal why the Vikings crossed some of the world's most dangerous seas without fire and lived to tell the story. Before the longship ever appears, imagine a quiet Viking village at dawn. Smoke rises from turf-roofed homes, tools strike wood, waves roll against a rocky shoreline. This is where the real story begins. When people think of Viking voyages, they usually picture the longship. Its sleek wooden hull cutting through North Atlantic waves has become one of history's most iconic images. But the ship was only the final piece of a much larger system. A perfectly built vessel meant very little if the people aboard couldn't survive the journey. The real genius of the Viking world began long before the ship reached the water. Someone had to raise hardy sheep that produced the right kind of wool. Others sheared the fleece, cleaned it, spun it into thread, and wove dense cloth strong enough to resist freezing wind and relentless sea spray. Historians estimate that producing a single Viking sail required months of skilled labor. Clothing demanded similar patience and craftsmanship. Much of this work happened quietly inside Norse households, far from the heroic stories of exploration. Without it, many voyages would never have left the shore. The same was true for food. Fishing, hunting, smoking meat, making cheese, and storing butter all happened months before the first oar entered the sea. Every successful expedition depended on careful preparation. By the time a captain ordered the ship to sail, the hardest work had already been done. The voyage itself was simply the final test of a survival system built piece by an entire community. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of the Viking story. Exploration was never the achievement of a few legendary sailors. It was the result of countless ordinary people preparing for an extraordinary journey. But if this survival system was so effective, how did it carry the Norse across an ocean so feared that many believed it could never be crossed at all? Imagine standing on the deck as the coastline disappears behind you. Ahead lies nothing but open water, no landmarks, no certainty, only the belief that somewhere beyond the horizon, whether following known routes or searching for new ones, land still waits. That was the reality facing Norse sailors. They pushed farther into the North Atlantic than almost anyone before them. The voyages to Iceland and Greenland followed routes that became increasingly familiar over time. But the journey to the coast, later known as Vinland, was far more uncertain. Every crossing carried the risk of violent storms, navigational mistakes, and simple exhaustion before land was reached. The medieval Icelandic sagas preserve memories of these voyages. They describe ships blown off course, crews trapped in dense fog, and expeditions forced to turn back before reaching their destination. Some voyages succeeded, others failed. Together, these accounts reveal a very different picture from the popular image of fearless Vikings effortlessly conquering the sea. The ocean was never conquered. It was endured. What kept these sailors returning was not blind confidence, but careful preparation. Every voyage relied on generations of practical experience. Clothing, preserved food, disciplined crews, and ships built for harsh conditions worked together as one survival system. Even during parts of the medieval warm period, the North Atlantic remained dangerous. Milder conditions reduced some risks, but they never removed them. The sea still demanded absolute respect. Seen this way, the discovery of distant lands was never the achievement of one captain or one lucky voyage. It was the result of an entire culture refining the same survival system across generations. Each expedition taught new lessons. Each lesson made the next next voyage slightly more survivable. After following every piece of evidence, one final question remains. What was the single greatest reason the Vikings survived where so many others would have failed? A longship cuts through black, freezing water beneath storm-filled skies. The crew rows in silence, faces stung by wind and salt. Every movement is deliberate. Survival depends on discipline, not heroics. Many people assume the Vikings survived these voyages because they were simply tougher than everyone else. It is an appealing idea, but the evidence tells a different story. Strength alone cannot explain how generation after generation crossed one of the harshest marine environments on Earth. Even the strongest sailor cannot defeat freezing temperatures, relentless wind, and icy seawater through determination alone. What kept these crews alive was not one extraordinary advantage. It was the way many ordinary solutions work together. Crew members avoided using open flames aboard ship, reducing the risk of catastrophic fire. Thick wool clothing slowed the loss of body heat even after becoming soaked. Preserved food supplied the energy needed to replace that heat through constant physical work. Carefully organized rowing shifts, shared sleeping arrangements, and generations of practical experience ensured that no single part of the system carried the entire burden. Each element supported the others. Remove one piece, and the entire strategy became weaker. That is what makes the Viking story so remarkable. They did not invent one miraculous technology that solved every problem. Instead, they refined dozens of practical solutions across generations. Together, those solutions formed a survival system capable of carrying people across an ocean that many believed was impossible to cross. Perhaps that is the greatest misconception about Viking exploration. It was never driven by reckless courage. It was driven by careful preparation. Their confidence came not from ignoring danger, but from understanding it, and that understanding changed history. The real legacy of the Vikings is not extraordinary toughness. It is the timeless lesson that careful preparation, shared knowledge, and small improvements repeated over generations can achieve what brute strength alone never could. A young sailor sits quietly on the edge of a longship, watching dark waves roll beneath him. Beside him, an older crew member adjusts a wool cloak and begins to teach, not from a book, not from theory, but from years of surviving the sea itself. When people think of great Viking inventions, they usually imagine a weapon, a ship, or some remarkable piece of technology. But the evidence points to something even more important. The greatest tool the Vikings ever built wasn't something they could hold in their hands. It was shared knowledge. No single sailor discovered how to survive the North Atlantic alone. Every lesson was earned through real voyages, tested by storms, refined after failures, and passed from experienced crews to the next generation. How to weave wool that resisted freezing wind, how to preserve food for weeks at sea, when to row, when to rest, and when to turn back instead of challenging the ocean. None of those ideas seems extraordinary on its own. Together, they became something far more powerful than any single invention. They formed a living survival manual carried in memory instead of on paper. That helps explain why Viking exploration spread so successfully across the North Atlantic. Their greatest advantage was never fearlessness. It was preparation shaped by experience. Each voyage added new knowledge. The next became slightly safer than the last. Over generations, countless small improvements created a survival system capable of carrying ordinary people through extraordinary conditions. History is not always changed by one brilliant breakthrough. Sometimes it is transformed by hundreds of practical ideas working together. The Vikings didn't master the ocean by defeating nature. They learned how to work with it. A longship slowly disappears into the mist, its silhouette fading beyond the horizon, while the knowledge that carried it forward lives on. Picture a modern cargo ship crossing the North Atlantic. A steel hull cuts through gray water. Powerful engines drive it forward. Satellites guide its course. Weather forecasts track every storm, and rescue teams stand ready if something goes wrong. Now imagine making the same journey without any of those advantages. No engines, no satellites, no weather forecasts. Just a wooden longship, a wool sail, a crew that trusted one another, and generations of knowledge passed from one voyage to the next. That is what makes the Viking achievement so remarkable. Their greatest success was not simply reaching Iceland, Greenland, or the shores of North America. It was creating a survival system so effective that well-prepared crews could repeatedly cross one of the world's harshest oceans using only the resources available to them. Every part of that system mattered. Strong ships, layered wool clothing that continued insulating even when soaked, preserved food that fueled endless hours of rowing, the discipline to avoid unnecessary risks, including open fire at sea, and above all, practical knowledge refined across generations. Together, these pieces transformed an impossible journey into one that could be repeated again and again. History is rarely changed by one great invention or one extraordinary individual. More often, it changes through countless small discoveries. Each one seems insignificant on its own. Together, they become something far greater than the sum of their parts. The Vikings did not conquer the North Atlantic by overpowering nature. They succeeded by understanding its limits and respecting them. In the end, the real fire that carried them across the frozen ocean was never burning on the deck. It burned quietly in knowledge, careful preparation, and the determination to learn from every voyage. That may be the greatest legacy the Vikings left behind.